Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we are talking about the difference between a protagonist and an antagonist, but more specifically we're going to talk about character wants versus character needs as well as empathy. In my opinion, story is very much about character. That's who we relate to, that's who we root for. What the character goes through is what pulls us through the story. It's not necessarily the plot or the premise, though those are certainly contributing factors, as well as the how in-depth your world is and things like that. But I think that character is where a lot of writers go very wrong. And I also think that this is why a lot of young writers, specifically teenagers, but also people in their early 20s, I think this is where these writers go wrong. It's easy to come up with a plot or a circumstance or situation for people to get through. It's easy to write a story where your character has to defeat an evil villain, but these things are not relatable. And what I mean by this is people don't do things just to be evil. Yes, there are sociopaths in the world, and yes, there are good stories with this villainous character like comic books, like the Joker. But if you're writing sort of a realistic story, this isn't what you want to necessarily go for. So when it comes to, or let me just dig into this a little bit. The reason why I think that teenagers have a hard time, or younger writers have a hard time with writing these believable antagonists specifically is, when you're a teenager, you look very internal. That's when we begin finding ourselves. That's when we begin figuring out what sorts of things matter to us. That's when we start to look at why we are the way we are, why we make these types of choices and these types of decisions. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone goes through this self-identifying phase, mainly when we're in our teen years. But if you're constantly looking internal, it's hard to see the outside world. I went through this as a teenager where if someone did something to hurt me or to slight me, it was always this idea of, well, that person's just an asshole. And that's never the case. That's almost never the case. People do bad things for reasons, whether they are well-intentioned reasons or to get from point A to point B, to protect themselves or protect somebody else. There's always a reason. And that's what I mean by we're going to talk about wants and needs today. Because when it comes to writing a story, antagonists and protagonists are the same. They all love something or someone. They all want something. They all need something. The only difference is that these wants and needs come into conflict with one another. Your protagonist in your story is typically your main character. That's the person that you want your reader to root for. That's usually the character through whose eyes we're seeing the story. And the antagonist is the character or characters who want something that opposes what your protagonist wants. A really good example of this, a lot of authors do this really well, but I think one of the authors that does this very well is George Martin. In the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire, Ned Stark is probably the main protagonist, and in relation to our morals and our moral compass, he's a pretty good guy. He wants to serve his king. do right by him. He wants to see the true heir reinstated to the Iron Throne after Robert Baratheon dies. And his antagonist, or the antagonist in his plotline, is Cersei Lannister. And it's easy to say that she is a bad person because one of the first scenes in which we see her is her and Jaime doing the dirty. And then, Jaime pushing Bran out the window. But these two characters, Cersei and Jaime, they aren't doing these things because they're evil. The reason why they're doing these things is because they need to protect their relationship, hide the fact that they're in love with each other, to protect each other, but also to protect their children. And that's what we're going for, really. You need to have antagonists and these opposing force characters in your story, but you also need to know why your character is doing these things, because there is 99.9% of the time going to be a reason why a person is doing horrible things. But this comes back around to the character guides. You want to know your character's background. You want to know what they want, what they need, what's driving them, what's motivating them to do these things. But you don't have to include all of this stuff in your story. I talked in the last character video about I give each character 3 hobbies. Those 3 hobbies do not need to be included in the story. If you want to give your characters favorite colors or a favorite pair of shoes or whatever, those things don't need to be included in the story. Those are tools for you as author just to get to know your character. And this is where you can start going into like a villainous antagonist. You as the author should know why your antagonist character is doing bad things, but you don't have to let the reader know. This is the Lord Ruler in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn. For the whole first book, for most of the Final Empire, the Lord Ruler is just like a dick. He's just a bad guy. He does really bad things. He treats people like crap. He runs this country where there's slaves. Most of the people are enslaved, and it's just really shitty. But when we get to the end of the story, before the Lord Ruler dies, he reveals, the deepness or the darkness, and, basically tells Vin, you fool, what are you gonna do now? You're gonna unleash the deepness. So through the whole majority of that book, there's mystery, but there was a reason why he was doing terrible things. And on the flip side of that, you can also have stories where you have a protagonist that is not on the same moral plane as you or I. And this is the Godfather movies. This is Sons of Anarchy. Our protagonists in those stories are gangsters, bad guys. They are drug dealers and gun runners and murderers. But we're rooting for them because those are the people through which we are seeing this story, which would make the antagonists law enforcement, opposing gangs or motorcycle clubs or opposing forces. And that's really that's the big difference. The antagonist is not always morally corrupt, and the protagonist isn't always the good guy. And the way you figure these things out is to build your character guides, get to know your characters, figure out what they want, what's motivating them, and then figure out who are the best characters through which to see this story. And those are who your protagonists are. And then the characters that you have opposing these characters are going to be your antagonists. So that's all I got for you guys today. I just wanted to give a little bit of clarity on that. My resource for this week is one that I use a lot, not just specifically for characters, but everything from, the business of writing to outlining to short stories, and it's just a big one. So I wanted to share it kind of early on. And it's Dave Farland / Dave Wolverton's blog. He is a very renowned science fiction and fantasy writer. He headways the L. Ron Hubbard's Writers of the Future contest. And his blog just has this huge backlog of really intense stuff. He also does writing classes. So you can find him, just Google Dave Farland blog, and it'll bring you right to it. So that's all I have for you guys this week. Maybe might do some more character stuff next week, or I'll get into plot. We'll see. But for now, as always, you should be writing stuff.